Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, Salma Yaqub. Over the past 2 years, Muslims have watched with increasing concern as the English Defence League has established itself as what some would describe as a populist street movement. Many Muslims regard the EDL as racist and anti-Muslim, although the group says that it is only against Islamic extremism. The EDL regularly protests in towns and cities with large Muslim populations, and there have frequently been clashes between local residents and EDL supporters. But little is known about the makeup of the group and the beliefs of its members, as there is no formal membership list and most of its activities take place online. Now a new report has sought to shed light on the group. The think tank Demos says that while the EDL is usually regarded as anti-Islamic, the reality is actually a little more complex. Demos says supporters are characterised by intense pessimism about the UK's future, worries about immigration and joblessness. Before I introduce this week's guests, let's take a more detailed look at Demos's report.
The English Defence League was created 2 years ago, supposedly to fight Islamic extremism. Its supporters now hold regular demonstrations, often in towns and cities with large Muslim populations. The group claims it isn't racist or against Muslims in general, but Muslims have frequently pointed to the links of its supporters and activists with the far right. They also point to racist chants, sometimes heard at demonstrations, and messages posted on forums. The demonstrations started off as small gatherings, but have increased in size, leading some to describe the EDL as the biggest populist street movement in a generation. But little is known about the group and its members, because the organisation has no formal membership, with much of its activities taking place online. Now, the think tank Demos, which specialises in extremism and violence, has conducted the first large-scale study of the EDL. The report used responses from 1,295 sympathisers and supporters, and includes data on their demographics, involvement in EDL activity, political attitudes and social views. The results are somewhat surprising. They show that although the EDL is commonly seen as an anti-Islamic group, the reality is actually more complex. The report says that supporters are often pessimistic about the future of Britain and worried about immigration and unemployment. At the same time, they often display pride in Britain, its history and values, which they see as being under attack from Islam. But the study also found that despite often violent demonstrations, which have frequently involved racist chanting, many members are committed to peaceful protest and other forms of activism.
Which monitors their propaganda. Thank you for coming into the programme. We're also joined by Lord Maurice Glassman, a Labour Life peer. Thank you for being here today. In the studio, we also have Shainul Khan of the London Muslim Centre, who was involved in the recent protest against the EDL in Tower Hamlets. Thank you for being with us. Assalamu alaikum too. And on the phone, we have Dr. Matthew Feldman of Northampton University, who recently wrote a major report on the EDL as well. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us on the phone. And before we go to our guests, we have on the line also Mark Litter of Demos, who co-wrote the report and is joining us from Brussels and can only give us a few minutes because he's at a conference there. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
I know you've only got a few minutes with us. So in terms of your research, do you think this highlights something that Muslims and citizens in Britain in general should take some heart from, or is there still a lot of room for concern in your opinion?
I think what we've discovered is quite an encouraging picture. Really, it offers a number of opportunities for policymakers to tailor quite targeted and really evidence-driven approaches to a group which historically policy responses have been characterised largely by people sort of, making a sort of emotional knee-jerk. I think particularly the fact that we've uncovered that rather than being a monolithic organisation, the EDL's membership is made up of lots of different types of people with different types of grievance, particularly around culture and identity, is very encouraging.
So, of course, human beings are complex and you wouldn't expect each and every person you interviewed as part of your research to come out with the same lines. But in terms of how the general public should respond, and we've seen those demonstrations, they are often violent. There is aggression there. Whilst people are saying it's peaceful, I mean, what in terms of what do they hope to achieve by coming out with this kind of aggression? And we can't deny it is very much targeted at the Muslim community.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of questions there. I think one of them is the implicit sort of suggestion of the threat that the group pose on the ground. While it would be disingenuous of me to deny that there was some kind of risk posed by a small minority of the group who are hell-bent on violence, actually, if you look at our report, it paints quite an encouraging picture which is, while perhaps its views are distasteful in terms of its support for violence, it's really restricted to a much smaller hard core within the group.
So it's not just about the physical violence, though, is it? It's about the kind of attitudes, perhaps, which seem to be encouraged by this group, and they're certainly not one of cohesion.
No, I think there's certainly some truth in that. And I mean, if you look at their concerns, there are a whole raft of them, both economic but also cultural. And I think in sort of uncovering those and really sort of drilling down into them in a bit more detail, we're giving policymakers the opportunity to have something which they can really respond to.
Well, thank you, Mark, for joining us. I do understand you have a conference in Brussels that you're calling us from. We very much appreciate your time. If I can just come on briefly to Matthew before I come back to our studio guest. You heard the response there from Mark. What would you say as also a researcher into what the EDL does?
Well, I think that it's very important, the work that Demos has just recently published, and there's been now 3 reports on the English Defence League, one that came in at the end of last year, and our own, which was the second, published by the Radicalism and New Media Group, which really focused on them as a kind of social movement. Again, they don't have membership in a kind of a traditional way of paying monthly dues, let's say. Really, we're talking about supporters, and I think there's probably 2 faces. There's the online community, and of course the sort of street protest community. And looking at it from a social movement angle can help us perhaps to look at a little bit more closely its trajectory and some of its possible ways forward from where it is now.
Okay, well, thanks for that. If I could just come to our studio guest, Lord Morris, if I can come to you first. You've been associated with this trend, Blue Labour. You have in the past argued that there does need to be some kind of dialogue with EDL supporters. Would you still say that's important? And can you see why perhaps people may feel concerned that the more hostile elements will actually be pandered to rather than challenged with that kind of approach?
Oh, I can completely understand that, and I'm really delighted to be on your programme in order to correct any misconceptions too about what I've said. I'd like to declare my absolute friendship with the Muslim community over many, many years. The EDL are arguing that essentially they're making the culture wars argument, that it's impossible to have a democratic culture of the common good with Muslims. Now, what's vital is that the Muslim community absolutely refute this. So they are looking at the extremist elements of Islam, the people who mock Remembrance Sunday, the people who denigrate the British and the English traditions, and they're talking from a position of dispossession and powerlessness. So it's absolutely vital that the Muslim community engages with the democratic politics of the common good. And what I was saying is we need to talk about economic injustice, we need to talk about a living wage, we need to talk about housing and how Muslims and non-Muslims can work together, and that's the way of defeating them. Because
but of course, most people would totally agree with that. In fact, most Muslims, spend a lot of time distancing themselves from any extremist element. So this idea that Muslims need to do more and somehow the EDL is justified in its claims, which a lot of people would actually reject. This idea that it's the Muslims' responsibility still in the face of this aggression.
It's not just a Muslim responsibility. I mean, I'm from the Jewish community. We've got to do a lot more. And I have to face down lots of criticisms and rejections in the Jewish community who also make arguments that there's extremist elements and all these things. We've all got to do more. And I just want to express my absolute solidarity with the Muslim community and to say that there's always more to do to generate democratic solidarity and to build a better country. And the
and
argument
in terms of democratic stability, YouGov polls have shown time and time again that Muslims, when it comes to democratic institutions, have a higher voter turnout. They're more wedded to democratic institutions. When it comes to respecting law and order,
completely.
Muslims again have that respect.
So it's
for
to
that.
say, yeah. So it's to say that the gentle heart and gentle and radical heart of the Muslim community needs to be even stronger in the public realm, because that's the way to ultimately defeat the argument that there can be no common politics. So I'm completely with you on that.
Shonal, you've been demonstrating against the EDL when they've turned out. Do you think that's important to have that physical presence? Because some people say, well, just let them do what they're doing, and there's no point in responding to the provocation.
Well, I think we've seen up and down the country, wherever the EDL have actually turned up, there have always been huge clashes with the local people. There is the argument that, well, if you don't turn up at all, they'll just come and go. But the issue here is the fact that they have a particular propaganda that they're actually seeding out. Hatred against a peaceful, loving community, often coming along with ideologies which is not sympathetic to what is British. And if that isn't challenged through a peaceful means as well, I think they'll just simply get on with having their ideologies seeded into the community. The British National Party, when they first really started getting their movement on the ground, it was because that they were giving the platform and opportunities. Now here, if we give the English Defence League that opportunity to come into our communities and actually make themselves comfortable, then sooner or later that movement of hatred will start to grow. And this is not something that we would be, it wouldn't be very good for our communities at all.
So, Simon, you monitor the propaganda that the EDL give out. Do you think there is a real cause for concern, or are people giving them too much attention almost?
Well, one of the small criticism that I have of the Demos report was that I believe that because of the source that it's coming from, the EDL supporters, that there is a slight concern with a bit of exaggeration. But then again, I think...
What type of exaggeration? What do you mean?
Well, this whole numbers on the internet game, a lot of people that click like on a Facebook page aren't necessarily there to lend their support to the EDL. And I know when the EDL had a larger page before it disappeared and became a smaller page, a lot of people that were on that page as a like were people that were monitoring the EDL as much as there was EDL support. So I think... So you think
their support base has been exaggerated?
Yeah, I would say that it's exaggerated to a certain extent. I wouldn't go so far as to say there is no basis in their report at all. I would say that, a peripheral support and the hardcore, that's essential to make that...
So it's
to make that clear,
to
make that distinction, that there is a clear difference between numbers that they can turn out on the ground and people that can comment on the internet, because we can all have an opinion on the internet.
Okay.
I think that's very important.
If I can just come back to Matthew, often it's presented as some kind of spontaneous street movement, but we have had other shows where we've examined who's funding and what's coming behind this, and there does seem to be quite a concerted, conscious coming together of various interest groups as well as money behind the EDL. So, in your opinion, do you think that this is a bit more sinister and it's something that's ideological? It's not just some people with some grievances. And of course, in the time of recession, there are people with very real grievances, but surely that's a case of communities coming together and not being pitted against each other.
Salma, totally agree with you. I mean, I think what the other participants here are saying is we have to be careful if there's a demonstration of 1,000 or 2,000 EDL supporters to say you're all racist thugs, because there are some people who might very well legitimately be coming out to peacefully protest against what they understand as jihadi Islamism. I think the key thing that we really need to remember about both the EDL, its trajectory, and where it started from, as you mentioned, kind of from through football firms, through a response to protest against returning Anglian soldiers and so forth, and also some of the more shadowy connections with people like Alan Lake and various funders, perhaps behind the veil. I think the important thing to remember about the EDL is that they say they're against violent extremist Islamism. Well, aren't we all? I mean, isn't 99% of our communities absolutely against that same thing? So my concern is not that. I mean,